Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the NUS Middle East Institute's ME 101 lecture series, where we aim to provide a comprehensive overview of the Middle East. My name is Ilyas Salim, and today will be the 7th lecture in the series. So now, earlier on in the series, we explored some of the complex geopolitical entanglements in the region. And last week, we looked at some of the major political, economic, and developmental challenges in the Middle East. So today, we will be focusing on the challenge beyond economics. Specifically, we are going to be looking at the topic of renewables, which is becoming increasingly important to the region as global energy consumption and production patterns change, and as the Middle East states move forward with their plans to diversify their economies away from oil. So I'm very glad to have with us our esteemed speaker for the day, Mr. Philippe Rose. So Mr. Rose has over 15 years of experience in the energy sector as economist and commercial advisor. He holds an MA in International Affairs from the Fletcher School and a licentiate in Business and Economics from the University of St. Gallen. So since 2018, he has been helping build partnerships in the renewable power generation space for a large energy multinational, including solar voltaic, onshore wind, storage, and hydrogen. And his current area of focus is developing market access strategies for China. So prior to working in renewables, sorry, there's a bit of my screen just. Okay, so prior to working in renewables, Mr. Rose worked in conventional oil and gas, including 7 years in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, a secondee in gas public-private partnership. So Mr. Rose's area of interest is in managing political volatility in environments where private investors face ambiguity, and value advocacy is a particular challenge. So just before we begin, I'd like to mention some house rules. So as usual, after the end of Mr. Rose's presentation, we will open a question and answer session. And we really welcome questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box to the MEI events team so they can forward the questions to me and I can relay them in the proper order to our speaker. So now I think I'll hand over to our speaker. Mr. Rose, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ilyas. Thanks a lot for hosting me again in this series. It's a great pleasure for me to join you here and to share a few thoughts, not from the perspective of an academic, but more from the perspective of a practitioner whose life has been a little bit kind of bouncing around some of the topics that I'm going to cover. And what I'm going to try to do now is, as best as I can, take a step back and try to make sense of these various events and their implications for the Middle East. So the story I'd like to tell goes something like this. If I take inspiration from the historian Yuval Noah Harari and try to take a very long view of humanity's progress and direction, there is something quite special happening over the last couple of years, which is whereas human growth has been linked to the consumption of primary energy and biomass for centuries, a few years ago, this link went broken. And even with projected growth, the demand for primary energy is plateauing. And so with the Middle East as one of the key producers of oil and gas, this tipping point clearly has an impact, and it's reshaping the region, both because of the changes from a supply perspective in terms of the producers, but also importantly to do with how and how this energy is consumed and by whom. So then I feel it's important to talk a bit about the role that renewables are playing, and the story around electrification around the world and how that's impacting the Middle East. And in that equation of energy transition with renewables, the role of gas is instrumental and is crucial, and we need to understand that a little bit. So after having shared that, what I'm going to try to do is to ask a few questions about, whereas in the past we used to talk about geopolitics and the importance for regional and international power for a country to sit on resources like oil. Now that renewables are booming, is there such a thing as the geopolitics of renewables, or is it just a non-issue? As in the words of Professor Stevens, it's like trying to talk about the geopolitics of carrots. There is no such thing. So I'm going to try to provide a few directions or a few themes about, if we wanted to find geopolitics in renewables, where could we find it? And I'll end with some of the tail risks from what is turning out to be a bit of a chaotic transition. So this is my hope is this will actually trigger more questions, make you curious, maybe get you keen to read about it and speak up, and maybe find out about your own energy, where it comes from. Even ask yourself your favorite brands, what are they doing on sustainability and stuff like that. So I don't have smart answers to everything. I'm as I said, I'm a practitioner, but hopefully these remarks from my vantage point can orient you a little bit. And yeah, the more experience I have in these fields, the less I feel I know. So before going ahead with my story, I thought it would be interesting to you if I gave a few words about my life in the industry. So I've worked for 17 years in the energy space, and I feel that the trajectory of my career has been bouncing around quite a lot of these themes. So I thought it could be helpful to also give you a sense of what a career in energy really looks like. So I started out around 2004 in advertising, where I was trying to make it cool for graduates in Europe to join a big energy company. And at the time, the mood on campus was quite about, it was not so much about climate change, actually. It was more about resistance and reluctance to big corporations and the exploitation of corporations towards developing countries or towards communities. I spent some time in Ireland, where at the time there was visceral opposition to an energy project there, and even violence. And then I worked on Nigeria, where at the time my role was about trying to come up with attractive propositions for the Nigerian government on what to do with their gas. And it was about, is it better for the government to monetize its gas by exporting it, or to develop a domestic industry and already at the time I started asking myself questions about what is better. What is an export-oriented industry that brings revenue, fiscal revenue to the state? Is that better than a domestic industry that is subject to product theft and environmental damage and issues of that kind? And already I started getting a hint that fiscal dependence can cause problems in countries where the institutions are fragile. And so after that, it was still a head office job. I spent about 10 years in joint ventures, um, working very closely with host governments in Brunei, in Saudi Arabia, and in Iraq, where it was about nurturing partnerships. In the case of Brunei, in the face of declining production, which meant that there's a lot of thinking about longer term. What's the future going to be? With so much fiscal dependence, can the country diversify? What should it do? In Saudi Arabia, it was a gas project prompted by the desire to be more self-sufficient with gas and energy generation domestically to preserve resources for export. And already it was interesting to see that although technically the project had challenges, there were a lot of other issues at play to do with subsidies of gas pricing for domestic industries that were hampering the realization of a progressive vision. And then in Iraq, this was really probably the highlight of my career. And the picture here is one of my happiest moments there, where we organized International Women's Day in Basra, which is fantastic. As you can see, we're all smiling there. And this was about, the project was about a public-private partnership to help the country develop a commercial Iraqi company that could produce gas to help the country away from its dependence on diesel imports and other sources of imports for its fledgling power market. So in 2018, I left that space to go into the renewables world, which was really in full swing, working on power, trying to understand power markets very far away from what I had done so far, trying to understand solar for corporate users and how partnerships are done. I worked in onshore wind, and then more recently, my focus switched to working in partnership with city stakeholders on decarbonization. So I hope that gives you a sense of how my career was bouncing around. So now if we dive into the macro view, and for those of you who've read Sapiens from Harari that I love, I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand the daily hectic stuff and put it in the context of where's humanity going. So I think what we can say, if we want to simplify, but not too much, is there's been a trajectory where human growth, human progress, GDP, has been intrinsically linked to the use of primary energy. So for about a century, coal was helping the advent of the Industrial Revolution by powering steam trains, steam engines, steamships, producing iron and machinery. And that led to an explosion of energy use for about a century, especially with the availability of very cheap, accessible coal in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And then towards the turn of the 20th century, around the time of the First World War, oil started to be used more in a more dominant way, and a couple of key decisions led to its rapid adoption. We can probably pinpoint that to the decision by Winston Churchill to switch the Royal Navy over to oil, which is a major had a major impact, both in terms of improved military power due to the endurance of these ships, but also it actually impacted the mission itself, because it meant that you needed access to oil. So the First World War is morphed into a war about access to oil, and then prompted mass adoption and lots of secondary industries like plastic, etc. So this was a century of oil. And now what's happening, and what I'm trying to make sense of, is even though we're projecting a doubling of GDP between 2016 and 2050, global primary demand is only expected to grow about 15%. So it's really a decoupling for the first time in human history. And what's driving that is a mix of things, but it's the fast uptake of renewables is playing a major role, substituting fossil fuel for power generation. Not everywhere. In Asia, coal-based generation remains and is even increasing, but it's offset by decreases elsewhere. And so, of course, and the role of energy intensity in the manufacture of an incremental unit of GDP. So that's the long view. Now, if we try to figure out what does it mean for the Middle East, if we look around the 1970s, okay, so the world realized that it was tributary to decisions of OPEC on oil supply and on price in a cartel situation. And this really strongly shaped US foreign policy orientation in the region. And this is really, when people think of geopolitics, petrostates, it's that. But around 2013, things started to change quite fast. And initially it was a supply story, and then it became a demand story. I'll explain that. So one of the main factors there was the boom of US shale oil and gas. And shale is, to simplify, it's the ability to produce oil from an identified reservoir that is quite dense, where, so you know the oil is there, and all you have to do to get it out is drill as many holes as you can in that space. And each drilling, you know exactly how much oil you're going to get, and you know exactly how much it's going to cost you, but it doesn't produce very much. So you need to drill a lot of them. And back around that time, where the oil price was $100 and above, it was very profitable to do that. And it enabled the US to just massively ramp up its crude production to levels that rivaled Russia and Saudi Arabia. And free, of course, the US from its dependence on Middle East oil imports. And so around that time, and I was in Iraq actually that time. Funny enough, my job was to forecast oil prices. Don't ask me whether I got it right or not, please. Saudi Arabia, as a dominant producer, realized that it couldn't control price anymore because it didn't have enough levers, or its share of production was too small. So the only thing it could control was its production. And because it produces low-cost barrels, or barrels that are cheaper to produce than most of the other producers, it realized that its only kind of strategy was to keep producing and keep its market share, and then hope that it would drive other producers out of business. What it hadn't really anticipated is this wasn't just a supply story. There was also a structural demand change with reduced energy demand due to the rise of renewables and due to the economic climate at the time. And so the result of all this was that there was a new dynamic that came out, which is the new market makers became the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, and no longer, strictly speaking, OPEC. And producers were competing for market share as opposed to pre-agreeing quotas to control price. And also, lo and behold, the buyers of all that oil, with the US disappearing, ended up being replaced by East Asian buyers, with China at the forefront. And so some of the countries that had a fiscal dependence on oil and gas, like a large fiscal dependence, were particularly hit particularly hard. So Saudi first, but also the country I was in at the time, Iraq, that was in the midst of reconstruction and rebuilding its economy. Countries like the UAE were less directly impacted because they had less fiscal dependence, but the platform of the UAE was still heavily reliant on oil and gas companies being based there. So they did take a hit, a more indirect hit. So now, what does all this mean for the Middle East, right? So I'm saying tapering of oil demand, I'm saying renewables, all of that, but what does it actually mean for oil and gas in the Middle East? The truth is, one effect of this has been to cushion the price, because anytime the price dipped, shale went bankrupt and produced less, and every time the price went up, it spurred shale to kind of kick in, and the lag in shale is very quick, 90 days from investment decision to drilling. So for a while, until recently, it kept the price in a band. But also what it meant is that a little bit, I don't want to be too bold, but regardless of your view on the long-term oil and gas demand outlook, you're still going to have, and this is a chart that shows expected demand between 2018 and 2035, with a forecast from 100 million to about 110 million barrels. The Middle East is still going to be host to low cost barrels, and therefore its share of production is still going to remain ballpark figure about 30% of global production. So it's more it's less an issue of nobody's going to want to buy Middle East oil. It's more about how can Middle East countries monetize it. And so there's a couple of things. There's actually a lot of uncertainty on that picture, especially the price picture. So a couple of things could massively spur higher oil prices. Could be underinvestment in oil and gas, with a lot of large investors seeking to pivot away from oil and gas, so and no longer fund large capex projects. The decline of shale oil in the US is a risk, especially if you consider that a lot of that is funded by capital markets, and so any increase in interest rates in the US could wipe out the sector. And of course, unexpected demand growth, like especially Asian demand. So that could create a price spike. But equally, you could have a downward spike where demand could peak early. And the reason I'm saying there's a lot of uncertainty is because these forecasts are quite lumpy, in the sense that a lot of it hinges on how much demand China is going to have. So if you have a trajectory where China slows down because they focus on common prosperity, more of a domestic agenda, reducing inequality, all of that, and the supply chain issues we have right now continue, it is a plausible scenario which has an outsized impact on this. Right. So in a way, you could say that the Middle East is safe in its market share. They will produce the last barrels, but the more fiscal dependence they have, the rockier the ride. And price volatility is not good for anybody, because if you're a producer, it means your fiscal revenue is heavily impacted, but also the level of investment that companies are willing to make is less. And in a high price world, the incentive to diversify is less. And then when the oil price crashes, the means to diversify are less as well. So you're a bit in a catch 22. And then on off takers, so for buyers of Middle East oil and gas, swings in prices are usually an incentive to look for plan B, to look for diversification of exposure to oil and gas, more renewables, other things. Right. So I need to spend a few minutes talking about renewables, and then I'll, in general, and then I'll zoom in on the Middle East. So what's happening is it's really a system change where the world is electrifying. So if you look at the chart, this is showing a significant boom in electricity generation between now and 2050. And almost all of it, or most of it, a large share of it, of this extra demand is met by renewables. And it's driven by not only population growth, industry growth, urbanization. It's also driven by increased electric vehicle adoption and things like that. And also the availability of electricity, especially low carbon electricity, is actually increasing demand itself. So as you switch the system, you actually spur additional demand for it. So coal and oil generation us on a global picture are expected to decrease over the long term, but, and by long term I mean 2050, but gas generation, and I'll zoom into that soon, does remain an important part of the energy mix, peaking around 2035. What we need to understand is the cost of new build renewables is really going down an exponential cost reduction curve, where in more and more countries, new build renewables is actually cheaper on a kind of a total cost basis than fossil fuel generation, even coal actually. So it's a tipping point in the energy transition. And of course, there's increasing adoption of net zero targets by at a national level and at a corporate level. And I couldn't resist for this presentation. I promise it's not a bet that I made with a friend to talk about Bitcoin in an energy presentation, but it has, and this is an illustration, so hopefully it doesn't distract too much from my story, but this is about showing that with increased electrification, there are interesting side effects that go on. So Bitcoin mining is very sensitive to energy price. And of course, you need internet access, but the primary cost driver is energy. And so what's fun about this graph is that as energy prices have changed, the location or the co-location of hashing power has also moved. And so when China banned mining, and I'm talking about Bitcoin mining recently, so it's about half of the world's hash power went offline. Very, very quickly, the miners relocated to sources of cheap energy in the US and Kazakhstan, for example. It's an interesting unintended effect. So now, what does this mean for the Middle East? So the Middle East is also expecting significant energy demand growth through electrification, through industry growth, and through population growth as well. Now, whereas in many parts of the world, renewables are playing a significant role, in MENA, the region starts from a very low base. Like 95% of power generation until recently was burning oil and gas. And so even though huge efforts are being made in MENA and GCC to boost renewables, because of that low base start, only about 10% of its energy consumption or electricity consumption, sorry, will be met by renewables by 2040. So by 2050, it's expected to be about 35%. So, and this is a story that isn't widely known, but if you take, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, producing about 11 million barrels a day, 2 or 3 of those are actually used for power generation. So it's actually, as this energy demand is growing, it's actually a scramble to maintain export volumes in the face of this explosion in demand. So it's a race to try to keep up, but not only keep up, but beat that increase in demand, because the value of the export has until recently had collapsed. And the reason it's important as well is it has a lot of knock-on effects, this reliance on oil and gas for power. It's obviously, anything you burn domestically means you cannot export it, so there's a direct fiscal impact, but also there's quite large fuel subsidies in GCC. So whatever is kept domestically for gas and fuel costs significant money from the state budget. So for GCC, we're talking tens of billions of dollars. And then there's, of course, the environmental impact, which matters because of the net zero Paris commitment. And then on the positive side, there's also a missed opportunity to develop a domestic renewables industry, which, contrary to oil and gas, which is not so labor intensive, the renewables is from across the board in technology, in manufacturing, etc., etc. So this, according to this estimate from Arena, is a couple 100,000 of jobs that could be created with a transition. Okay. Having said that, we need to talk about gas, and also it was a lot in the headlines. So gas plays a key role, paradoxically, in the energy transition, because in the transition where you add renewables to your energy mix, renewables are what's called intermittent, where the wind can blow or it can decide not to blow, depending on the weather. The availability of solar can go from available to just non-available. As illustration, there are days, even in the UK, which doesn't have a reputation for being particularly sunny, that the whole country can be powered off renewables some days, yeah? So 100%. And so that's where gas comes in, because gas allows flexibility, because it can be turned on and off in a matter of hours. And that means you can have idle capacity that you kick in to account for fluctuations. And it's also significantly less CO2 intensive than coal. So in the absence of battery storage, gas is a bit like the missing storage. Okay, so the consequences of that are only just now sinking in, given the current energy crisis that we've had in China and in Europe right now. So in Europe, the energy prices have gone through the roof, and through a combination of factors, again, around gas. Like one was because in the Netherlands and in the UK, there was less shortage than normal for local reasons. We're not going to go into that. And also Europe was making greater reliance on LNG and Russian piped gas. And by bad luck, LNG faced also additional LNG supply faced a crunch because of the surge in demand from China, itself a function of weather and post-COVID economic recovery, issues with coal supply, regulatory issues to do with the way power pricing is done in China, and I would say ill-timed environmental KPIs from some government officials. So that's one. Also, Russia was unwilling or unable to increase its delivery to Europe. And let's be honest, there was also poor planning by European gas buyers. So this led to the price hikes that we've seen, and even energy retailers going bankrupt because they couldn't procure energy to meet their obligations to their customers. Right. Okay. So now let's have a look at looking for geopolitics in renewables. And so when we talk about geopolitics, we really talk about accruing political power from us occupying a certain geographical space, to simplify. So a country with lots of produced oil could derive political power by deciding how to export it, and that's where the concept of petrostates came up. It also granted such states very large fiscal surpluses that they could use for all kinds of things. So now, when we talk about renewables, where is that to be found? So what I try and what I'm going to try to do with these 5 points is give you my interpretation of the relatively scarce but good literature that's coming out on this topic, and then I'll try to apply it or translate it to the Middle East. So the first theme, I think, the most important theme, I think, is not a direct effect of renewables, it's an indirect effect, and it's the effect of fiscal risk on states that are more dependent on oil and gas for their state budget. So even though they may keep their production volume stable, the prices are swinging due to the factors that we saw. And this means that if I'm thinking about Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Libya or Algeria, it means that there's less buffer for them to maintain a social contract, which is still to do with patronage and subsidy, direct payment, all of that in exchange for political legitimacy. And so we may see interesting effects of, especially if demand is slated to collapse, where such countries may want to monetize their hydrocarbons faster, either as a way of keeping market share or simply because they have no choice. And so this is what we can call the kind of the last stand by producers, or the literature talks about the green paradox. So the rush to monetize before it's too late. So this I think is one interesting indirect effect that is worth keeping an eye on. Keeping also in mind that China will remain a dominant oil buyer, and this of course plays a role in the Middle East. The second aspect here is what we'd started talking about, which is the geopolitics of gas as a transition fuel. So a couple of years ago, we were envisaging in the industry that gas would be the new oil, in the sense it would be a liquid market that you could buy and trade, as opposed to purely relying on long-term contracts. And what's turned out is that this model doesn't satisfy the needs of importing countries that require energy security, especially to deal with intermittent renewables. And so China was able to call on contracts to mitigate the impact of its demand surge, leaving Europe in the cold. It's also creating interesting new relationships. Like, for example, the US and India are partly more aligned politically because the US is a key seller of LNG to India. So that tandem is interesting. And then within East Asia, and I'm not even talking about the political rivalries, but just there is a rivalry simply on access to gas. Because if we talk about China, South Korea, Japan, and India to some extent are all competing for contracts with the same sellers, Australia, Qatar. So that geopolitical aspect of gas in the transition is one that is coming more to the fore very recently. Okay, now if we try to look at direct the direct geopolitical impact of renewable. Um, in itself, renewable is really like carrots. You cannot store the energy. Assuming you've got lots of it, it doesn't have any political value. However, I think a more helpful concept is the rise of what we could call maybe it's the best term I can find, and happy for other suggestions, but it's the rise of geoeconomics, where there's a which is to do with the control over trade balances between countries, and it's giving rise to new sources of competition, where technology dominance becomes crucial, to as does the control over supply chains. So and this is also about industrial policy. So basically, countries planning long in advance, where do they want to dominate in terms of intellectual property, so that their country has a chance to secure a part of the value chain in this space. So and this even goes all the way upstream to the raw material, where countries are anticipating the continued reliance on minerals extraction and the mining industry to ensure the success of their domestic industry. So countries that are visionary are investing in copper mines and various other minerals to ensure uninterrupted supply for their domestic players. So this mining picture is unfortunately a little bit of a tragic story for developing countries. I'm thinking particularly African countries, because it means it maintains or it perpetuates a dependency where the relationship is typically mining investment against developing of domestic energy projects. So it doesn't allow these countries to climb up the economic value chain and become self-sustaining in their own right. So to illustrate this topic about geoeconomics, it's interesting to see examples. So Germany, for example, has quite early on decided that hydrogen was its thing. So a lot of state funding behind hydrogen research. China and South Korea have for very long had an industrial policy around low carbon innovation. For South Korea, it started in the 1970s, following the 1970s oil shock. China is super interesting. They focused on solar, with a lot of partnerships with foreign companies to kind of jumpstart their domestic industry, and they're about to become the largest R&D spender. And they did the same for wind as well. So through subsidies initially, and then by phasing those subsidies out. The US has not had a single focus on R&D as an industrial strategy. However, they've more relied on the internationalization of standards to realize the value of their R&D. Some countries also practice state-backed patent purchase to spur domestic industry. So this, I think, is where the action really is, and then the question is, what can the Middle East do? And it just raises the question, if if the Middle East was able to compete, could it compete in things like regional grid integration, monetizing their the last quantity of resources of solar and wind resources that they have? So it raises that question. The fourth theme would be more, I wouldn't really call it geopolitics. It's more like local or structural. So with renewable power being intermittent, it does require balancing and flexible generation. And some pairs of countries have done that quite well. Denmark and Norway, where one produces wind and the other one does hydro, and they can help each other out depending on whether the wind is blowing or not. And when the wind is blowing, then the other country can pump its water back up, its hydro, so use it as a battery. And then you have places where it doesn't work that well. There was in the literature, there's the example of because the European power grid is very well connected, you had unintended effects where Germany had an oversupply of renewables, which meant that in Poland, some of the conventional power plants were too expensive to be able to secure a slot in the market, and were idle and lost money, which caused political tension. So there is clearly the potential for transitional friction, both from a let's say a hardware or infrastructure perspective, but also in terms of market design failure or market design unintended effects. And so that's one aspect to look at, is if the GCC countries go in the direction of the integrated grid and want to export power regionally, what effects is this gonna have? And then the last item on that list, this one is more longer term or hypothetical, but it's so I want to leave you with this more as food for thought. Is something that maybe not everyone is realizing, is electrification means actually decentralization, because as you include renewables, it means consumers become potential producers of energy if they have rooftop solar, for example, or battery storage. And so there's a whole bunch of market participants buying and selling among each other, offering grid services. You have microgrids emerging, energy communities, all of them using digital blockchain. You can create trustless systems. Your electric car can be connected to your house and act as your battery. So you have all of that stuff. So it actually means that the role of the state, which traditionally we thought the state does utility, is changing and could even become obsolete, where the importance maybe of cities is more important than national government. And so it really raises questions about what people start expecting from the state, and it changes that relationship. On the other hand, because electrification means connection and data, it generates a huge amount of data about individuals. And it also gives opportunities for states with an aspiration for more social control to have almost real-time access to individuals' life. And it opens doors to much more effective, let's call it state management. Yeah, so on the one hand, you can say that in more liberally minded countries, this is an empowering direction. On the other hand, it means it could give more tools of kind of coercion, I would say. Um, and of course, that question is open when we look at the Middle East. So to kind of wrap up my little story, I think we can talk about a tipping point where humanity is taking a different path in terms of what powers its progress and its growth. Um, and that is having a huge impact on the Middle East, both in terms of um, the supply side and demand and consumption. And the role of renewables in driving an acceleration of electrification will be crucial to manage in the Middle East, either as an enabler for regional integration, for technological kind of strategy and empowering its own people, or actually the reverse. The role of gas is one to really watch, the wild card. And then what I try to do in the last part of the story is look for geopolitics in the carrots. And the topic of geoeconomics, national technology strategy, competing for supremacy of certain spaces within that in tech, is, in my view, something new, something to watch. And then we ended with the tail risks from a messy transition, with the impact on fragile states, with weak institutions. We talked about the green paradox, where hydrocarbon producing countries want to make the money fast. We talked about market failures and the importance of grid integration, and then the impact on the role of the state, the role of subnational entities, cities, energy communities, and the risk of greater levers to exert social monitoring and social control. So before stopping, I'm going to do a quick kind of snapshot of what I'm seeing as an industry guy could be or are actually cool opportunities in this energy transition. Some of them you might know, some of them maybe not. One which took me by surprise is the application of blockchain to energy, whether it is helping trustless systems for market participants to exchange energy without central authority and in a secure way, or the tokenization of all kinds of things, smart contracts to do with carbon credits or energy supply, energy demand. Then the Internet of Things, energy management, optimization of assets, creating digital twins and various other methods to help manage a ever complex integrated energy system, and also with the strong role of AI to figure out ways of doing this real-time matching between supply and demand. And some of it has to do with behavioral economics. So how to get people to consume energy when energy is available and not consume when it's not available, and people and companies. Then of course hydrogen, in even though there's a lot of hype around it, but in areas of mobility, of decarbonizing specific industries that cannot be electrified, heavy goods. There's a lot going on in that space. Then quite a lot of activity around carbon credits and nature-based solutions. So how to accelerate the removal of carbon from the atmosphere before um, some of the structural energy transition shifts actually materialize. And then lastly, I put this term of commercial integration. There's a lot of opportunities in really helping companies make the first step in decarbonizing, combining various offerings together, creating ecosystems, doing arbitrage in power markets between what the customer is prepared to pay and between what the suppliers are willing to generate. And also a lot of activity going on in the data space. So even use of satellite data to better model and monitor and predict emissions and things like that. Yep. So I'm gonna stop there and open it up to questions.
Anyway, thanks very much, Mr. Rose, for that wonderfully formative lecture. It was fascinating to get a practitioner's perspective on the industry and the realities of it. So now we're entering the question and answer session. So again, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box to MEI events. So again, don't send it directly to our speaker. Please type it to MEI events so that we can sort through the questions and present them in the proper order. So there are a few questions already. Let me read out the first question. There are 3 questions actually by Dr. Abhishek, but what I'll do is I'll give them one by one so that you have time to answer it. Okay, the first question is, how does the Middle East give IP rights to renewable companies innovating, producing, distributing energy, and at the same time allow a competition in the energy market to keep prices low, to incentivize consumers to opt to use it?
You want me to start with that, or you want to go through multiple questions?
Okay, I guess I could read out all 3 of the questions. So the second question is, so oil was a hot topic in US Middle East competition to absorb more of the global energy market. And US shale twisted scales in favor of US. So is the Middle East trying to get back that global market share with renewable innovation and production? And the third question is, so developing countries rely heavily today on coal, oil, and gas. So how does Middle East, how does the region balance its focus on this developing world, this lucrative market demand for oil, with the upcoming demand for renewables? So those are the 3 questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me share a few thoughts. I think maybe I'll start with the market share question. So the way the Middle East producing countries preserve market share is primarily through their ability to compete with alternatives from a buyer's perspective. So if I am a China buyer, I want to make sure that I can minimize my cost, but I also have a diversified source of supply. And the Middle East has the advantage of enabling production of almost the lowest cost barrels. So when we talk about market share, it's about the decision between how much spare capacity am I willing to sacrifice, or how many wells am I willing to shut down in an effort to try to meet OPEC quotas and hopefully preserve prices. So the decision that Saudi Arabia did in 2014-15 was to not only preserve its current levels of production, but actually increase production as a way to drive away competition. So where we are at current oil prices, the issue of market share is, I would say, less relevant, given the ability of most most Middle East production to be actually realized. And the truth is, there's not that much capacity outside of Saudi Arabia to really materially move, kind of change production levels. So most of that swing capacity resides actually in Saudi Arabia. So now on intellectual property, I think especially Saudi Arabia has identified, as part of its Saudi vision, a number of areas where it believes it can develop its own technology and capitalize on some of its inherent technological and kind of industry advantages, and especially it's around ammonia. So Saudi Arabia is betting heavily on ammonia as a hydrogen-based energy carrier that it thinks it can produce cheaply because it's an associated product of the gas production. And so what countries, especially like Saudi, need to think about is which are some of these niches in the energy transition that it can compete with and develop proprietary IP, create, and it's especially it's more around spurring national innovation through subsidies, through creating sandboxes for investors to come, make it easy for foreign companies to bring in staff, and enable cross fertilization so that there is a domestic industry actually picking up. So most of these countries are looking at how can they leverage their position in oil and gas to look at things like carbon capture and things like that for clean chemicals or other fuels. So in terms of another advantage that they have is because of the high quality resource in terms of sun, they're able to command very, very low prices when they bid for large scale renewable projects. And so some of the Middle East based developers have been able to capitalize on that to then go international. The last question on coal, oil and gas, I'm not sure I really picked it up. So I don't know if I answered what the
Would you like
question
me
was.
to repeat the question?
Yes, Ken.
Okay, basically, developing countries rely heavily today on coal, oil, and gas. So, how, does the Middle East balance its focus, on this developing world because it presents a lucrative market? And how does this balance that with, the upcoming demand for renewables? Yeah.
So if you, I'm struggling a little bit to answer that. The Middle East doesn't shape who buys the oil and gas. So there will always be buyers of that. So for Middle East countries, it's I mean, no Gulf country is talking about going net zero and stopping oil and gas production. So there's no real link, I would say, between the export activities of Gulf countries and developing countries per se. GCCs are capitalizing on the appetite of developing countries for oil, gas, and coal. And if we look at East Asia, I mean, a lot of the existing demand of coal is due to the large availability of low cost coal that enables India and China to sustain their domestic energy demand.
Okay, thanks for that, Mr. Rose. There are a few questions now, so I'm going to pick them out. Okay, with the upcoming collapse of oil and gas due to the adoption of EVs and the collapse of the ICE industry, so what are your thoughts on the importance of securing and establishing battery production lines for grid scale and home battery storage to store the energy generated from renewables?
Yeah, so I wouldn't go so far as to talk about oil and gas collapse and battery storage in the same sentence, because we're really talking very different timescales. I mean, we've seen that in the case of Asia, we actually have an increase in oil and gas demand, even related to coal. So it's only at a time horizon beyond 2035 that we start seeing a decline, for example, in gas. The only way you could have something that you could characterize as a collapse would be if, for example, the economic situation in China were to deteriorate rapidly, for example. So to me, I wouldn't really link these 2 points together. But the point about storage is storage, and really we're talking about all forms of storage, is absolutely crucial as part of the energy transition. So if we look at Europe, the ability to store energy using batteries is tiny. You're talking less than 1% or so. But it is a booming sector, and the more storage you're able to build into the system, the more you can increase your reliance on renewables and then start phasing out gas. So the system of the future will be primarily renewables with wind and solar, some hydro and all of that, and then storage. There is, and let's not forget, there'll be also market design to enable shifting of the demand and shifting of consumption to minimize peaks and therefore make the system much more efficient. But storage also means things like potentially hydrogen, because hydrogen is a molecule, so you can put it in a cavern, and then when you need it, you can release it and you can use it to generate power. And then when you have surplus renewables, you can use that to make hydrogen by electrolysis and then refill your caverns. So that would be the system of the future that would be free of hydrocarbons. But as per IEA and other projections, oil and gas is going to remain a reducing but still significant part of the energy mix for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thanks for that, Mr. Rose. I have a couple of questions here. So how optimistic are you about plans on the shared electricity grid in the Middle East region? So that's one. And the second one is, will AI algorithms stabilize share speculation in the energy markets?
Will AI enable what? Sorry?
Will AI algorithms stabilize share speculation in the energy markets?
Share speculation. So on integrated grids, this to me is an area of massive potential. It's the logical thing to do, because it allows countries to balance their strengths and weaknesses from a resource perspective, and pool capacity. So whether this capacity is to do with gas powered or hydro or whatever it is. So the more diverse country you're able to connect, the more you're able to create resilient grids, and also minimize cost. So the topic of grid integration um, um, is very topical for GCC, and on paper it would allow resolving significant issues plaguing the system, from over reliance on gas to power shortages in the south of Iraq. Um, it has all going for it. It requires, it goes really beyond technical solutions, because a lot of these technical solutions are there, and they're economic as well. So it's more to do with political harmonization, agreement on common pricing structures. How do you compensate for capacity services, and all of that. If you look at our region, ASEAN and Singapore, Singapore is doing more and more in that direction. So, for example, agreement just I think yesterday on a connection with Indonesia for green power. So that, if you take the politics aside, this is really the way to go. Now, AI on stabilizing, I think you said share price of energy, so stock market.
Share speculation, yeah.
I mean, to me, this is not my expertise. The use of AI, I think, is much more relevant in the finding ways of steering consumption and supply, and helping stabilize the system, but also in figuring out behaviors of users through cities and things like that, to optimize systems. So figuring out where to place infrastructure, figuring out how to because we're talking about exponentially complex system, where every piece of machinery can be at the same time storing and using energy, and so figuring out how this all works. This is a space where AI will play, or is actually already playing a significant role.
Okay, I have something of a technical question here. So could you explain why hydrogen would be a viable energy source, as when we would need to spend energy to obtain and store hydrogen in specialized tanks? So it might sound like a very inefficient energy source, even compared to conventional oil and gas. Yeah.
Yeah. So hydrogen is an energy carrier. So you have to make it. And so at the moment, there's two aspects. One is looking at, from a consumption perspective, how can we use hydrogen? Where can we use hydrogen to replace the burning of hydrocarbons? So there's a lot of activity going on in heavy transport, and so mobility, but also, of course, in industry. Like there's a lot of industries like cement and glass and others, where steel, where you need to generate a lot of heat, and electricity is just not the right way for that. So hydrogen, if you can decarbonize in that way, if you could switch to hydrogen, you can reduce emission. But then the question is, how do you make that hydrogen? So at the moment, a lot of the hydrogen is made as a byproduct of gas and stuff, and so it does emit CO2. So the trick is to look at what can we do to generate hydrogen in a clean way. And so that's why there are quite a number of projects looking at using offshore wind to then, whenever the wind is blowing, to use it to do hydrogen by electrolysis. But you're correct that by unit of energy, there's a step less if you connect your electric car to your offshore wind farm, as opposed to generate offshore wind energy and then go through another step. So you only do that for applications that make sense, and the applications that make sense are fewer than you would read in the press. There's actually only a very specific set of circumstances where producing green hydrogen, as it's called, and using it in applications like industry and mobility makes sense. This is typically in industrial hubs. So if you are, for example, around Rotterdam, you're quite near the North Sea, where you can produce offshore wind cheaply, and you're also quite near or near enough to then connect that to electrolyzers around the Rotterdam area. And that area is in immediate vicinity to the industry that we talked about, that is hard to decarbonize, and happens to be located where there's lots of transport networks. So you have a lot of synergies that allow you to massively reduce your cost of clean hydrogen, because everything is co-located at the same space. And such projects allow starting to reduce the cost curves. So you can start making much larger electrolyzers. You start having economies of scale, improving your supply chains and all of that. And you start entering a zone where you can compete with the alternative, which would be using diesel for vehicles and buying non-clean energy and having to have lots of carbon penalties as a result. So it requires a market design to bridge the cost gap in the form of carbon pricing and various other kind of market tools. So I hope that makes sense. But you're right, and maybe I should have started with that. You're right that we're not going to see private passenger vehicles suddenly, oh, it's going to be, Singapore is going to be just hydrogen vehicles everywhere. No, electric vehicle is always going to be cheaper. Now, if you look at maybe public buses, maybe for some routes or some countries, hydrogen will be economic, or in the marine space, maybe even in aviation, you might see hydrogen. There are cities where the climate is very cold, so electric batteries don't work, and then suddenly hydrogen becomes positive. So it's very specific pockets where all the stars align, if you like.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Rose. We're kind of running out of time, so let me ask you a couple of questions. Okay, turning away from the Middle East for a second, your last point about mankind's choice of what powers growth, how do you account for China saying today that it would ramp up coal production and burning, even reopening closed mines? So is this transitionary? So that's the first question. And the second question, I can remind you of the question later, is you mentioned gas. So Qatar and Iran sit atop the world's biggest gas field. So what is your prediction for how this will reshape the balance of power in the Middle East, given your reasoning that gas is a transitional fuel?
Yeah, so on China gas, I think we can spend a couple of seconds on that, and it's really a bit of an unfortunate, I would say, combination of factors, where the and it's all of these factors happening at the same time. So the flooding and all of that meant access to coal was more difficult. At the same time as demand went up, economic demand went up because of post-COVID, and there were also a few issues in the way um, in the way power pricing works in China that caused problems where. Unlike deregulated markets, Europe, US, where power, so the grid buys power on a marginal cost basis. In China, there's a coal benchmark price which is fixed or set. And so this meant that if you're a coal producer and your raw material cost is high, you don't have any incentive to sell power because you lose money. So these were some of the regulatory deficiencies that China is addressing already, but were not yet in place. And on top of that, given we're at the end of the political season, there was benchmark like KPIs to do with energy intensity and absolute energy consumption, which were going to be busted, and so that spurred provincial officials to do load shedding, basically to tell some factories to shut down. But the reaction now is obviously short-term economic stability and all that trumps. So coal is the last resort. But what it's also doing is it's actually giving more leverage to the central government to accelerate the liberalization trend that's going on already. So basically to liberalize some of the pricing mechanism and move more towards market mechanism, especially in this coal benchmark that we just talked about. So I think what we're seeing is temporary blips, but that could actually make it make it easier to speed up the shift away from coal. Right. Then you asked about Middle East and gas and all that. So very clearly, the Qatar's position as one of the world's largest gas exporters has enabled the country to play its cards from a foreign policy perspective extremely well. It allowed it to survive the embargo, and it allowed the country to play I would say an outsized role in the recent, for example, discussion with Afghanistan. So I think what we're seeing maybe is a bit of a climb down in the relationship within the GCC compared to the blockade time, and largely I think it is the acceptance by the GCC members of Qatar's ability to play its cards very well. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks so much, Mr. Rose. We are nicely at the end of our time today. So I'd like to thank you very much again for your wonderful presentation. And thank you to the audience for your questions, and also to the MEI events team for making all this possible. So just a shout out to our next event this coming Tuesday, which will be an interesting one because we will be hosting retired US General David Petraeus, who will discuss the US's shifting strategic priorities. So also stay tuned to our ME 101 series, and next week we'll be having our 8th lecture, which will look at the impact of climate change in the Middle East. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Mr. Rose.